Okay, for this lecture, we're going to talk about nitrogen and phosphorus and how they have changed dramatically on a global scale because of human interactions or human behaviors. So we talked about in the other lecture why nitrogen is needed, and we talked about that nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, can limit plant productivity. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on phosphorus. So phosphorus is needed to make DNA and ATP, but phosphorus can be hard to come by, which can cause it to be more limiting for nutrient uptake. So here's a image of the global phosphorus cycle. So all those rectangles are places where phosphorus is stored. And the largest storage of phosphorus comes from rock. So currently on Earth, in the building of Earth or creation of Earth, all the phosphorus is here and it's finite. So we have and it's found in rock. So phosphorus enters ecosystems into the soil and into the system through weathering of rock. Important to note, unlike nitrogen, phosphorus does not have a gas form and is not found in the atmosphere. So here's just a little schematic diagram of a simple diagram of the terrestrial phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus enters the ecosystem through weathering of rock, and plants can take up phosphorus. They can only take up phosphorus in the phosphate form, so this is an ion. Like nitrogen, as plants take it up, they convert it to the organic form of phosphorus and store it in their leaves and other tissues. When the plant drops its leaves at the end of the growing season or the plant dies, that organic phosphorus is in litter. Plants can retranslocate, so move phosphorus out of the leaves that they're about to drop and store it into other tissues to conserve and minimize loss of phosphorus when they drop their leaves. So that litter has phosphorus or in the organic form. It can get decomposed by microbes and it gets converted to phosphate, that inorganic form. And then also phosphate can bind to soil particles. So it can bind to it and it can release, and there's different controls over that. A lot of that has to do with the pH of the soil. Phosphorus can also be leached from the system. So phosphorus is an anion. And as you remember, soils generally have a negative charge. So cations, which have a positive charge, tend to adhere to them. But another anion, like phosphate and nitrate, because soils have a negative charge, don't adhere to them as well, and they often get readily leached. We can get some phosphorus entering the system through windblown dust. There's studies that show that dust as far as the Sahara Desert can blow across the ocean and deposit into Central America and sometimes like southern part of the United States, and can add new phosphorus inputs to a system. Now, phosphorus can also be extracted through mining. So the phosphate that we use in fertilizer often comes from mining of rock. So when we think about the phosphorus cycle, phosphate does not undergo oxidation reduction reactions under most conditions, so there's less microbially driven changes in phosphorus or phosphorus availability. Phosphorus does not have a gas form. And phosphorus can be bound tightly to soil minerals in the soil. And that's usually an abiotic process related to changes in soil pH. Aquatic systems like lakes are often limited by phosphorus, and so can old tropical soils that have had a lot of leaching. So ecosystems where we have a lot of rain, have precipitation, that's a lot of water moving through the soil that can pull out nitrate and phosphate. And then also the new sources of phosphorus for very old soils, there's less input from weathered rocks because if they're really old soils, that rock has been mostly already weathered. And there's this hypothesis or schematic that was that two scientists with their last name Walker and Sayers came up with in about 1976 to try to understand phosphorus availability over time in ecosystems and soils of different ages. So on the x-axis we have time, and then on the y-axis we have a unit of phosphorus. And so if you look at that top line on the graph, younger soils or younger ecosystems are going to have more phosphorus, and then that phosphorus availability or the phosphorus in that system declines over time, and that's through losses from leaching, but also through less inputs over time. Also, in this diagram, it shows different forms of phosphorus. So most of the phosphorus is in mineral form. Over time, it become occluded. When we use the term occluded here, we mean that it becomes bound to soil particles, which may or may not make it available to plants anymore. And in some cases, when it binds to soil particles, it's unavailable for plant uptake. Non-occluded is what we would consider plant available phosphorus. And then organic phosphorus is the phosphorus stored in plant tissues and litter and organic matter. So again, that non-occluded is the phosphorus that is generally available for plant uptake. And you can see out of all the phosphorus in the system, it's a small portion, and then it can decline over time as well. So that Walker-Sayers model was a hypothesis for trying to understand changes in phosphorus over time. Like great scientists we all are, people want to study and actually test that. So there's a very historical study, an iconic study in ecosystem sciences, where they try to test to see if what Walker and Sayers proposed is actually seen in ecosystems. In this study, they used a series of islands in Hawaii that varied in soil age. Because these islands are created by volcanic activity, there's different ages of the islands in the soil. So this is called a chronosequence of soil age. So if we look at the diagram, we see that the big island of Hawaii, the site that they selected, was about 20,000 years. And then Koki was 4.1 million years old, so the oldest island. And so they set up the same experiment at each of these islands that varied in age, soil age. And at each island, they had 4 treatments. So they had a control. They had one that they added nitrogen. They had a treatment they added phosphorus. And then their treatment, they added both nitrogen and phosphorus. And then they measured the diameter growth of a dominant tree in these systems called Metrosideros polymorpha. Okay, so here's some data from their experiment. So the top graph is the site that was 300 years old, so the youngest site. The middle graph is a site that was 20,000 years old, so an intermediate site. And then the bottom is a graph from a site that was over 4 million years old. On the y-axis, we have the plant response, so tree growth rate in millimeters in diameter per year. And on the x-axis, we have the different treatments. So their control, where they didn't do anything with, their nitrogen addition plots, and then their phosphorus addition, and then their nitrogen plus phosphorus. And so looking at this data, what can this data tell us about which sites might be limited by phosphorus? So again, we look at limitation that if we add the nutrient that we think is limiting growth and we see an increase in growth compared to our control, that suggests that growth was limited by that nutrient. So I'll give you just a minute to look at these and see if you can, if this data helps you try to understand which sites growth might be phosphorus limited. Okay, so let's look at that top graph, the youngest site. Let's first look at the nitrogen treatment, and we should ask ourselves, is the growth rate um, greater than the control, the same as the control, or less than the control? And so it looks to me that it's greater than control. So it looks that there was an increase in plant growth with nitrogen addition. Now let's look at, again, we're just looking at the 300-year-old site. Now let's look at phosphorus. Was the growth rate greater, equal to, or less than the control? To me, it looks like it's very similar, that there's probably, doesn't look like there was any change in growth. And then let's look at the last one where they added both nitrogen and phosphorus. So we also see an increase in growth there. So based on this data, it suggests that this younger site is not limited by phosphorus because we saw no change in phosphorus when we just added phosphorus. Now let's look at the intermediate site. Let's just focus on the phosphorus addition right now. Do we see a change in growth when we add phosphorus compared to the control? So for me, it looks like it's very similar to the control, which would suggest that at this site, phosphorus is not limiting growth. Now let's look at the last one. This is the oldest site. When they added phosphorus, it does look like that plant growth increased relative to the control. So this would suggest that this site is phosphorus limited, because when they added phosphorus, they saw an increase in growth. And if we go back to the Walker-Sayers model, that makes sense, right? Because they they propose that older sites would have less phosphorus availability, and hence they would be more phosphorus limited. Okay, so let's look at these graphs again, and let's see if they can provide information about nitrogen availability. So now we're going to just kind of focus on the nitrogen addition treatment relative to the control. So if we look at the youngest site, when they added phosphorus, it does look like it increased growth relative to the control site. If we look at the intermediate site, it's kind of hard to tell, but it does look like there was a slight increase, but maybe not statistically significant because those error bars are overlapping. Now let's look at the oldest site. And the oldest site, when we're looking at the nitrogen addition, it looks like there really wasn't any change relative to control. So based on this data, this suggests that the youngest site is nitrogen limited, or plant growth is limited, limiting so plant growth is limited by nitrogen at the youngest site, but not at the oldest site. And you might be asking, well, what about the nitrogen plus phosphorus? So when we see a difference when we add that element alone and no difference on the other element, then it is most likely that that nitrogen phosphorus combination is driven by the element that was limiting. And so let's look at the youngest site. So the youngest site, we saw an increase in growth when we added nitrogen, but not when we added phosphorus. So when we add nitrogen and phosphorus and see an increase in growth, that suggests it was probably driven by the addition of nitrogen and not the combination nitrogen phosphorus. Now let's look at the oldest site, the graph at the bottom. Here we didn't see any difference when we added nitrogen, but we saw a difference when we added phosphorus. So that would suggest when we add nitrogen and phosphorus, the increase is probably most likely driven because of the addition of phosphorus. Now let's go to that middle age, that 20,000-year-old, the middle graph. We saw a little increase in growth with nitrogen and really no change with phosphorus. But when we add nitrogen and phosphorus together, we see an increase. So you might be asking, like, what's going on here? So some people consider this what they call co-limitation. So Nitrogen alone and phosphorus alone aren't limiting, but when you add them together, it like the system is limited by both nitrogen and phosphorus, so you need to add them to both to see a response. All right. So going back to why we would see an increase in growth when we add nitrogen at the youngest site, we have to think about how nitrogen accumulates over time in ecosystems. So remember that nitrogen inputs into the system come from fixation of atmospheric nitrogen, which is a gas form. So we've got to accumulate nitrogen in the system over time, and this happens through the process of succession. So when we have a very new ecosystem with new young soil, we have very little nitrogen in the system. Over time, the bacteria start to fix nitrogen. We have some pioneer plants that colonize. Often those pioneer plants are ones that have the symbiotic relationship with bacteria to fix nitrogen because they can colonize low nitrogen soils because they've got that relationship with bacteria that can enhance the nitrogen in the soil. So over time, we start to build up the nitrogen in the soil, and then we also have these plants that have higher nitrogen content in them. The plants die and decompose. We start to add more nitrogen in the system. Now we're getting to a point where we can have the system becomes more favorable for other plants, so we get other colonization. So those lines on the graph are the nitrogen concentration in the soil, in the forest floor, and the mineral soil. And you can see that over time, kind of opposite with phosphorus, is that we start to see more nitrogen accumulate over time. So younger soils, younger ecosystems tend to have less nitrogen and therefore are more nitrogen limited. And then older uh, uh, systems or soils have more nitrogen, so they're less nitrogen limited. And then in contrast, in phosphorus, we see younger soils having more nitrogen, so in phosphorus, we see younger soils having more phosphorus, so less phosphorus limited. And then over time, they lose a lot of that phosphorus and they start to become phosphorus limited. So this is kind of a basic understanding in ecosystem ecology with nutrient cycling that younger soils tend to be more N limited and older soils tend to be more P limited. That's a generalization. We see patterns to that, but there's always some exceptions to the rules. So just kind of recapping, phosphorus is more available in new, younger ecosystems, while nitrogen tends to be more available in older systems. So if we look at it in a global perspective, I know some of you doing your biomes were like, there's no phosphorus measurements, I can't find these out. And some of that is because of the type of ecosystem you're looking at. So ecosystems like tropical systems that are around the equator have old soils. These are older systems that haven't been glaciated over time. They tend to have less phosphorus because their phosphorus has gotten leached, there's less inputs, and they tend to be more phosphorus limited. They also the phosphorus tends to be studied more than, say, younger systems like alpine and Arctic systems that have maybe more recently been glaciated, they're younger, and tend to be more nitrogen limited. Okay, so there are other variables that can alter nutrient availability to plants. These are things like soil type, different disturbances, and different vegetation types. So all these variables can limit the fluxes of nutrients among different pools, and they can alter or influence the degree of limitation across different ecosystems and biomes. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the changing nitrogen cycle on a global scale. So we humans have significantly altered the global nitrogen cycle by several different processes. And one is the invention of the Haber-Bosch process, which essentially allowed humans to fix nitrogen in a chemically driven process that has now led to a doubling of nitrogen fixation rates over natural levels. So this is often called bread and bombs because the main goal wasn't to fix nitrogen to help grow more food. At the time, we were in a war, and these two chemists came together to try to find a way to provide ammonia um, to make bombs. After the war ended, they realized that they could scale this up and use it to make fertilizer. So this is called synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. That's different than organic fertilizer that comes from plants or manure or mulch. So this is synthetically derived. It's a chemical process that humans do in a lab. Now they do it in a large manufacturing and one thing to think about, it's a highly energetically expensive process. If you remember, breaking those N2 bonds takes a lot of energy. So in addition to creating all this nitrogen, it also uses a lot of fossil fuels to drive this reaction. Now, because of the Haber-Bosch process, we could scale up the production of a synthetic fertilizer. All this is just chemically driven, driving the fixation process to make a synthetic version of fertilizer. Now, that because many of our agricultural crops are in an N-limited system, when we put nitrogen on them, it increases productivity, and it has been suggested or estimated that this process that has increased the production of synthetic fertilizer, which we can put on our food, our agricultural systems, has supported the addition of 4 billion people with food since 2008. So it is important, but like many things that humans do, it has its consequences. So here is just this is a little outdated, but I think the pattern is still very similar. So this is just looking at nitrogen fertilizer application globally. The color indicates the amount or concentration of nitrogen applied. And I'll give you just a minute to look at this and maybe think about where you might see some patterns. So where are we putting a lot of the nitrogen fertilizer? In what systems is that happening? So if you notice, a lot of the nitrogen fertilizer is happening in more temperate zones, in areas where we have high agriculture, but also high economic or wealthy countries. Making synthetic nitrogen fertilizer and purchasing it to put on agricultural fields costs money. And so in many places where regions where money is harder to come by, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is not added. So about 40% of the world's population depends on fertilizer to produce the food that we eat. Now, I just want to show you how this anthropogenic, and when I say anthropogenic, that means human-driven uh, fixation compares to our background fixation. So the bottom part of this graph I showed you before, the purple is natural biological fixation that's happening with bacteria. And then the green is this coming from lightning. So together that's what we consider background or natural sources of nitrogen fixation. Above that is human-driven fixation. So, and we have it separated. So not only do we get fixation through this Haber-Bosch process, which is that yellow part, that's synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, we also are increasing fixation rates because we're increasing planting crops that have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria to fix nitrogen. So all our legume crops and our green manure help also fix nitrogen. So we're adding more crops that fix nitrogen. That's more nitrogen fixed globally. And then, in addition, when we burn fossil fuels, there's a small amount of the byproduct of that is fixation of atmospheric gas. So, on estimating, about half of human additions come from fertilizer production, and about a quarter come from increasing the amount of biological nitrogen fixation, mostly through crops. And if you look at the totals there, that our now more current anthropogenic fixation almost equals that of background. So we have doubled the amount of nitrogen in our globe, in our ecosystems, and that has consequences. I just wanted to show you also this. So this is a graph kind of looking at the contribution of the Haber-Bosch process on the world's population. So there's a lot of lines here. Let me just point out a few things. The blue line represents the current world population increase over time. The pink or reddish line represents the population that we would have if we didn't have the Haber-Bosch process to create all of this synthetic fertilizer. So this suggests that the Haber-Bosch process of making synthetic fertilizer and then putting it on our agricultural systems has allowed the increase the capacity to feed a larger population globally. Couple other things to point out. The purple is the average fertilizer input, and you can see that the fertilizer input has dramatically increased since the 1950s when the Haber-Bosch process was created. And that also subsequently influenced meat production because not all of the agricultural crops that we're adding synthetic fertilizer are for direct human consumption. A lot of that is fed to cattle and pigs and sheep, and which then humans then eat. So I do want to say that the Haber-Bosch process has been a significant contribution to society, but again, there's always some consequences to that. So here's again the nitrogen cycle. And it does show here the reds are, let's see, what did I want to point out here? There is, so if we look at, there's a couple, it's got the contribution of flux from atmosphere to plant biomass through agricultural nitrogen fixation, which is about 30, I think it's teragrams. Sorry, my little face bubble is blocking the units. And then we've got things like biomass burning, industrial nitrogen fixation is at 100. So that just kind of shows you the relative contribution of these human-influenced fluxes. Kind of look in there. Okay, so a little bit back to the phosphorus cycle. How does the size of the anthropogenic fluxes compare to natural fluxes in the phosphorus cycle? So here we've got mining, erosion, the dust. I think if it's yellow, then it's more human influence than if it's orange. So what are the impacts of, so if you have ever used synthetic fertilizer on grass or like your lawn grass, or you've seen people use it, when you go to buy synthetic fertilizer, the main components are nitrogen and phosphorus. The nitrogen is made through that Haber-Bosch process, but the phosphorus in that synthetic fertilizer comes from mining. And again, we only have a finite, a limited amount of phosphorus. So phosphate is mined to make synthetic fertilizer. And here's kind of just a graph of looking at phosphorus production because of mining. We see a dramatic increase in phosphorus production after the 1940s. And it did reach a peak. And some of the reason for decline is that the resources are declining. So we're starting to mine a lot, becoming less. There's becoming less available to mine, and what is available is becoming more expensive. So here's just looking at global patterns of phosphorus fertilizer use. And again, the colors, the darker colors indicate more phosphorus. And again, we see a lot in more developed countries. We see adding more phosphorus in these tropical countries as well. So again, when we think about the changing nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, we see an increase when we use synthetic fertilizer. It increases the inputs to our systems. Now, when we put a whole bunch of nitrogen fertilizer on our fields, we can get production of ammonium if that. So part of the problem is the amount of fertilizer that we put on agricultural systems, we put on golf courses and our residential lawns. Usually we're adding way more than plants can take up at that time. And so a lot of it can get volatilized. It can be nitrified. We can increase denitrification and we can increase leaching. So what happens to all that excess fertilizer that plants, if we're putting a lot of fertilizer on there and plants can't take it up immediately, it gets lost to the system, but it has to go somewhere. And usually what happens is it goes into waterways, especially the stuff that's leached. It goes through our streams and rivers and ends up at places where those streams and rivers dump into the ocean. And so, and what that happens is that aquatic ecosystems, the plants also are usually nitrogen or phosphorus or both limited by it. So when we give aquatic systems nutrients, we see an increase in plant growth in the aquatic systems. Those plants die, and as they float down into the water column, they start to get decomposed by microorganisms in the water column. Microorganisms need oxygen because they're heterotrophs, so they start to deplete the oxygen in the system, and then that leads to dead zones because other fish and other aquatic organisms also need oxygen. So it's this increase in plant growth in the waterways because of excess nitrogen and phosphorus. The plants die, they start getting decomposed by microbes, and during the process of decomposition, those microbes start using oxygen in the water, which depletes the oxygen for other organisms. And that creates what we call dead zones. And here's just a particular big dead zone area that varies and seasonally by when we put nitrogen and phosphorus or fertilizer in our mollisols in the Midwest on all those cornfields that come down the Mississippi and go into the Gulf of Mexico. And yes, I will call it the Gulf of Mexico. So that results in these dead zones. And there's a nice little YouTube video you guys can look at that kind of walks you through this process that I think can be helpful. Here's another example of this happening in Florida. In central Florida, there's a big lake called Lake Okeechobee. Just north of that lake is a lot of agricultural fields, specifically growing sugarcane. And they add a lot of phosphorus to enhance the growth of the sugarcane. And then that leads to eutrophication in Okeechobee, which then drains down into the southern part of Florida through areas of Miami and into the ocean. And that also leads to these eutrophication and dead zones around the tip of Florida. So that's a problem, but all problems at least have some way that we can try to minimize that. And so there are ways to minimize nutrient runoff, and one is to decrease the amount of fertilizer applied. So trying to figure out what is the optimal need for those plants and only adding just enough to get the response, but not adding too much. The other thing is using cover crops. So in between the main crop, you would plant cover crops. Some of these could be fixers, so they're adding and replenishing nitrogen in the soil. One of the films that I hyperlinked in one of my other lectures talks about the use of peanuts, growing peanuts as a cover crop. Peanuts form a symbiotic relationship with bacteria to fix nitrogen, and that then the dead plant material can get mixed in with the soil and add nitrogen to the system. So using cover crops to help reduce nitrogen loss, but also in planting, doing crop rotation where you have a non-fixer and a fixer. In some regions, I think in the Midwest, they now alternate between like corn, which is a non-fixer, and then a legume like clover or some other fixer as a cover crop in between, or soybeans are another one. So intermixing, like some years they do corn and then they alter and do soybean, so that you're not depleting the soil as much, so you don't need to add as much fertilizer. The other thing is adjusting the time of fertilizer application, so only applying when the plants are most active and able to take up that nutrients. The other is using organic fertilizer or slow release fertilizers. So organic fertilizer differs from synthetic fertilizer, is it's using organic material, so mulch or something that has a high, like manure that has a high organic, and then the nitrogen and phosphorus is in the organic form, not the mineral form, right? So then it can't be easily leached, but over time, that organic form gets decomposed and mineralized and becomes available. So it's a slower process, allowing us kind of a slow release of nutrients that plants can take up. Also, we have this idea of buffer zones. So they grow trees and shrubs and prairie plants in between the agricultural fields and then the aquatic systems. So when you get nutrient runoff, it's going to hit that little forest or shrubland area. Those plants can take it up to minimize how much is going into the river system. And then the other that often, or can happen too, maybe a little bit more extensive, is this idea of recapturing runoff and recycling it and treating it and then maybe using it as a fertilizer again. So here's just a graph, kind of an older study looking at trying to figure out the optimal nitrogen fertilizer application rates for different crops. So here's the crop yield, and here's like estimates of application, fertilizer application. So you find where these two cross. So, you know, we want to only add as much as we can get maximize yield. So for here, if we're adding phosphorus here, the amount, or let's say if we're adding fertilizer here, the amount we're adding is a lot more, but we're getting the same rate of return, right? The yield hasn't changed. So we want to find, as soon as the amount that we can add that will initially get that increase, but making sure that we're not adding more and not getting more of a response. So looking for the optimal amount and making sure we're not over adding fertilizer. So that's one approach. Here's a diagram of some kind of what a buffer zone might look like. We've got our agricultural crops here. We've got a buffer strip. We've got these grasses and sedges, that's before you reach the aquatic system. So if we get leaching, that these grasses and sedges will take up nutrients before they get into the waterways. And you know, those buffers also have a secondary component or benefit in that they can offer biodiversity and habitat for, you know, animals and insects as well. So this is just looking at the effect of different buffer zones on nitrogen. So this is like the bottom graphs are looking at, we got nitrate, and then we got phosphorus, and then we've got an herbaceous buffer versus a hybrid popular buffer. And I believe that this is uptake or the amount in the soil, suggesting that maybe herbaceous buffers in this system might be more favorable than hybrid. But again, buffers are one way to minimize that runoff into aquatic systems.